You're listening to Journey for Truth with internationally known medium, Tai Yi practitioner, and radio host Tammy Urbanic.
Hello and welcome to Journey for Truth on iHeartRadio and YouTube. Thank you for joining me. I'm Tammy Urbanic. Journey for Truth is always on demand and with many new episodes. On JonahLifeInstitute.com, you can sign up for their free newsletter. In a newsletter, you'll see a lot of information on healing, seminars, questions and answers, great articles. And again, you can go to JonahLifeInstitute.com and sign up for that free newsletter. My guest this week is Jonathan Emord, a constitutional lawyer and author who speaks out about the FDA and large pharmaceutical companies. Jonathan, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Now, first, what led you to fight the FDA on behalf of other organizations?
Well, it's a long journey, but I started off in law school as a kid who loved the Constitution, who really believed strongly and was fascinated by the First Amendment. And I went to work in the Reagan administration and the Federal Communications Commission under Mark Fowler, and then from there went into private practice at Wiley Ryan, and then on to the Cato Institute, where I was a vice president at Cato, and then after that I entered private practice again, ultimately in my own firm. And when I was at Cato, I was contacted by Dirk Pearson and Sandy Shaw, who informed me that the FDA was in the business of censorship of truthful health information, and that they were a victim of it, and that they wanted to be based on a policy study I wrote for Cato on commercial speech to represent them in attacking the FDA, which I, after a long while, decided to do, and then left Cato and went into private practice and sued the FDA, and then fortunately for my clients won at the Court of Appeals level the case of Pearson versus Shalala. Since then, I've been involved in a number of issues involving the FDA, and we've had a good run of it, defeating the agency 8 times, really 10 if you take into account cases in which I provided assistance, but I can't claim credit for the decision alone, because we were involved with other lawyers as well.
Now, within the United States, there is this assumption that if something is FDA approved, it is safe or presumed to be safe. Why is this simply not true?
FDA is not a scientific body in the last analysis. It's a political body. Decisions about approving drugs, approving medical devices, allowing health claims into the market, and prosecuting parties, and directing resources of the government to prosecute parties. All of those decisions are made by politicians and are political decisions. So while someone may have a science background in the sense that they may be a physician, or they may be a vet, or they may have a PhD in pharmacology or something and end up becoming the FDA commissioner, the fact that they're ultimately answerable to Congress, they're ultimately answerable to the industry for their future employment, and their decisions are steeped in politics. So as a consequence, you can have drugs that are unsafe approved, and there are many. Mm-hmm. And you can have people like David Graham, who's a career civil servant, who is the associate director of the Office of Drug Safety at FDA, who has repeatedly excoriated FDA for approving unsafe drugs. And the proof is out there. I mean, we see adverse events occurring for drugs over and over and over again. Vandia, Vioxx, numerous drugs that have been approved have gone into the marketplace and have caused severe injuries, and many times that information was known to the agency and they approved the drugs anyway.
That is exactly what amazes me, that the FDA approves so many drugs that then have to be recalled, that have to be stopped from people actually consuming them. But then on the other hand, they want to, or I have read, that they want to control supplements, and they want to control other smaller organizations or supplements that people can take that can truly assist them, that are not something you need a prescription for.
Yes. In order to maintain control over drugs, FDA has created a regime that focuses upon the claims made for products as opposed to the physiological or the chemical composition or the degree of risk of injury or the physiological effect of substances. That was a choice made to maximize political control over the process to ensure that the drug industry was given market protection as broad as possible. So you see, people don't understand that the regime for regulating drugs, the Kefauver-Harris amendments, are really a byproduct of a rather unseemly deal between the drug industry and Congress, in which the drug industry expanded FDA power over the efficacy of drugs so that the FDA could serve as basically a lapdog for the drug industry and protect the drug industry from competition. So when even though it may be undoubtedly true that a natural substance has a positive effect upon disease, any claim of that sort, of the treatment effect of a product on disease, makes it a drug, and FDA prohibits it in order to protect the market exclusivity for the drugs it has approved. So, just to give you a common example, prune juice is a treatment for constipation. Every single human being on earth probably knows that. And yet, if a bottle of prune juice contained the words "good for constipation" on the label, or treatment for chronic constipation on the label, FDA would seize all those bottles, would prosecute the maker of the product for selling unapproved drugs, and would potentially incarcerate them. So, and certainly would put them out of business. So that's it, ridiculous, but it shows you the harsh and speech prohibitive and draconian effects of this regime, regardless of what the public's interest, needs, health interests are. There are many examples. In the Pearson case years ago, one of the primary substances in issue was folic acid, and FDA stood between the American public and the manufacturers of folic acid, preventing them from communicating to women of childbearing age that 400 to 800 micrograms of folic acid a day in supplement form would reduce your risk of a neural tube defect birth by 40 to 80%. As a consequence, there were, as the courts found, 2,500 preventable neural tube defect births a year and countless NTD-related abortions. And even though those horrific consequences followed directly from censorship of the information, FDA censored the information because it simply didn't want the public to understand that non-drug substances, not substances not approved by FDA as drugs, have therapeutic effects.
Mm-hmm. So they are simply controlling what manufacturers or what organizations are allowed to state in their product. Have they gone as far as squashing information that really could be of assistance in treating a disease, a significant disease, for the very sake of protecting profits from a large pharmaceutical corporation?
Well, that's the overall effect, and that's the understood effect of censorship of nutrient disease information. So it took us a very long time to win the case for omega-3 fatty acids, reducing the risk of coronary heart disease. Years, 6-7 years of litigation in order to get the agency to finally relent and allow that claim into the marketplace. But all the while, it was protecting all of these drugs used for that purpose from competition, and there really is no other justification in the end.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the evidence is overwhelming for folic acid, for omega-3 fatty acids. It was even so profound that Management and Budget sent the FDA a prompt letter demanding prompt action on our petition because they said that an estimated 110,000 people a year were dying from what could be preventable sudden death heart attacks as a result of the heart connection we sought not being open to the public about omega-3 fatty acids, but FDA continued to drag its feet for a number of years, accepting that those consequences, all because in the end it's protecting a regime that is a quid pro quo with the drug companies. The drug companies are willing to have an extraordinarily costly drug approval process requiring upwards of $600 million of investment per drug in order to get it through, which is a huge barrier to competition. Invention or discovery of a therapeutic effect of a chemical is the start of it all, but to get through the FDA, you've got to pay a massive sum in clinical trials and in application fees and so forth, and no one can play that game except state-sponsored monopolies, the existing big drug companies.
Right.
So they have a lot at stake here in this regime, and if you winnow down the regime such that the public comes to understand that many substances in nature, dietary supplements and foods, have a role to play in the treatment of disease, then they lose their exclusive protection, and any diminution in profitability or interest in drugs and any indication that will cause physicians to recommend non-drug substances is a profit killer.
Right.
It's a threat to the long-term existence. You open the door a little bit, they're fearful of the Pandora's box effect or sliding slope effect. They imagine that if you allow anything in through the supplement aisle that can be said to have a therapeutic effect, sooner or later there'll be so many products competing that it will undermine the market for drugs.
Absolutely.
So it's an archaic view that they have, and they protect that old, stultifying regulatory regime to the death in defense of this because of the enormous amount of money involved and the influence. Congress is largely controlled by the drug industry, as is the FDA.
Well, it is exactly what you were stating earlier, that the FDA is not set up to have people's best interest in mind, but that is not what many people believe. And so that is one of the reasons why I'm having you here on Journey for Truth, is because I understand what you're saying. I understand that that is not true. And it's important that people also understand that. So how is Monsanto and the FDA linked?
Well, Monsanto is another creature of government. K Street lobbying that protected it in the beginning and helped it grow. Came out of World War II, very prosperous chemical company, and it has its tentacles deeply into the FDA and to Congress, such that you remember one of the aides to Commissioner Kessler, his last name was Taylor, got in a little trouble because he designed a regime that would allow GMOs into the marketplace without serious testing for safety at FDA, and then it was discovered that he was involved in representation of Monsanto as an attorney. There were these obvious conflicts of interest, which he didn't use to recuse himself from involvement in the rulemaking process. So he was farmed out to the Department of Agriculture in order to reduce the public pressure. But then shortly thereafter, in the current administration, he was brought back as a advisor to the commission, and the role of Monsanto being protected by the agency, its interests being protected by the industry, just continued on throughout. It is patently outrageous that a GMO substance put into a product does not beget from FDA determination that labels should reveal it to the consumer, but instead FDA plays a protective role for Monsanto of allowing GMOs to exist in products and not be identified on the theory, unproven, that GMOs in every instance are indistinguishable from
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the absence of large-scale randomized controlled trials and a long-term study, it's simply impossible to know that when we alter the genome of products and essentially create new products that we ingest, that those will not have some adverse effects, increase allergic reactions, or otherwise invite a greater incidence of cancer. It may be that toxicological studies fail to reveal the difference. It may be that they are the same, but the fact of the matter is that the public has a keen interest in knowing what it is. People are anxious to be able to distinguish between what is natural and what contains GMOs, simply because they wish to consume products that do not have GMOs in it.
Many
that
do.
Alone is a justification.
Right.
It's a justification to reveal it. And just as if, just to give you a hypothetical, it may be biochemically indistinguishable when we use natural coloration in a product that changes it from its color in nature to another color, and we sell it. Nonetheless, the FDA requires you to reveal the color in the labeling because it's of consumer interest that they understand that it is a altering the color. And yet, when it comes to, and even though these things are innocuous, supposedly, when it comes to something that may actually have an effect, even if unproven at this point, we deny consumers the choice by causing them to understand a product to be GMO-free simply because it's labeled natural, yet it actually contains GMOs.
Right.
That's an act of deception. It's a bait-and-switch type of approach, and FDA condones it.
And there are many people who, like you stated, really want to know if their food has been genetically engineered. And there are, though, many people that don't care because they see that the FDA has approved genetically engineered foods. It's all over the place. It's rampant. And there is, as far as I can tell, not much or any regulation in terms of regulating how much is out there, what we're allowed to know, and even the testing. From what I understand, the testing is still done in-house, meaning there's not third-party testing to verify if there is long-term effects from genetically engineered foods. And like you stated, there's not been a really long-term study. Well, GM foods have been around since, or they began progressively in the 90s, I believe. And we can look at the different health statistics, the health issues that have come up, autoimmune disorders, many, many different autoimmune disorders, leaky gut, so many issues going on with the brain, increase in cancer. And there are other things that contribute to those illnesses, but we've seen a huge spike in diseased people after Monsanto really began increasing the genetically engineered foods.
Yeah, glyphosates have been associated with these things, but, even if they're ultimately proven to be completely safe and innocuous, the fact of the matter is, it is a material difference in the food, in that you're changing the genome. And as a result, a consumer who wishes to consume foods that are wholly organic and natural, not ones that have been altered in their genome, should understand the truth. So truth in labeling is ordinarily the standard that operates, that you must disclose anything of material interest to the consumer. Well, 99% of consumers out there are interested in knowing whether something has GMOs in it. They may not care, but they want to know. They have a right to know whether it is, and for those who do care, it's the only way to avoid substances that contain GMOs if it's disclosed. So the industry says this is a ridiculous debate because GMOs are safe.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that's the case, use your freedom of speech and articulate plainly to people, this product contains GMOs, but don't worry because the GMOs in it are safe. You shouldn't hide the fact of deceive people by calling it natural or organic and selling it under false pretenses because you want to gather GMO-free people on false pretenses. Mm-hmm. You should be honest and forthcoming. Tell them what you're selling, what's in it, and sell them what you've said you are selling. And it's a fundamental basis for deceptive advertising. If someone fails to reveal material information to a consumer that causes the consumer to make a purchasing decision on false pretenses, yet that's what Monsanto and this industry wants to ensconce in the law. Now, I've helped write legislation that passed in Vermont for the Vermont GMO bill and also in Maine. And these bills are really nothing more than disclosure bills requiring clear information as to whether or not a product contains a GMO. And that's the least that the American public should expect and have a right to know with regard to GMOs. It doesn't mean that GMOs are deemed bad. Each of us has our own perspective on whether or not we want to consume those things. But in the end, if the industry wants to argue it's safe and it's good for you, be forthcoming. Tell people you're doing it. Tell them you put it in there, and tell them why it's okay.
Right.
And the rest of us who disagree or who think that it may not be true can follow our gut, and they can continue to argue to the contrary. But that's just the basic element of fairness and disclosure necessary for informed consumer choice.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I would recommend to any listeners to continue doing research on Michael Taylor and the revolving door between the FDA and other former employees of Monsanto. And it is highly unethical and questionable and can lead people to their own conclusions about the safety of genetically engineered foods. Now, moving on, let's also talk about the California vaccination law, which I believe went into effect this month. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, so the California vaccination law essentially removes the religious freedom exemption from the law, so that it's very hard now in California for a parent who goes to a public school to exercise any conscientious objection to vaccination because the schools are essentially able to force children who attend those schools to be vaccinated in order to attend, even if someone has a religious scruple against the state or otherwise harbors a conscientious objection, they nonetheless must be vaccinated. And it's a gross imposition. There's nothing. It's an aberration from 14th Amendment jurisprudence, due process jurisprudence, for the law to embrace forcible injection as a condition preceding for a public benefit. But it has done so in light of a really peculiar and tragic twist in constitutional law that occurred because of Oliver Wendell Holmes' ultimate favoritism for eugenics. Oliver Wendell Holmes, generally considered one of the greatest jurists in American history, was actually quite a racist and believed in eugenics, much as the Nazis did, favoring the use of eugenics to sterilize and eliminate from the population people who he considered to be less desirable.
Right.
So in the first decision on this point, which was actually a setup, there's quite a bit of literature on this and books written about it. He decided that a woman who was an unwed mother was possessed of low moral standards and was therefore defective, and he issued a decision by the Supreme Court that overruled her 14th Amendment due process liberty argument and said that she could be forcibly sterilized. On that basis, in no small part, was the Jacobson decision, then subsequently decided by Holmes, wherein he decided that a Massachusetts dissenter from a state bill that required vaccination for smallpox could be compelled to be vaccinated against as well, on the argument that if we were within contagion, if it somehow were to occur in California with any measles or whatever, you can obviously use the less intrusive alternative of taking those not vaccinated and allowing them to be homeschooled during the period of a contagion.
Right, exactly.
Like that. And that would be a less restrictive alternative to compelling them. But as it stands, the state has put its full force behind the notion that children, against their will, parents against their will, should be vaccinated. And so we traumatize kids unnecessarily and actually increase the risk, albeit arguably small, that children are going to suffer long-term adverse effects of vaccination, some of which are severely debilitating, some
absolutely,
rather than go without it, even though there's no real proof that we're posing a threat to anybody.
Exactly. Exactly. So do you see this as purely a money-making attempt? Because you're indicating that there's not great proof that that kids who are not vaccinated, or even adults who are not vaccinated, are posing a great risk to society, to the population. So does this come back to money?
Well, there is a financial element to it, but the primary driver for this is fanaticism, public health fanaticism, control. There are certain physicians who are really rabid on this point and believe that no one should possess freedom to dissent from vaccination whatsoever, regardless of what the real public health threat is. So they would vaccinate everyone, and they would compel people to be vaccinated against their will. And so the law doesn't go that far, but if they had their way, it would, so that every person would have a government file that would identify what vaccines they've had and what they haven't, and then you would be visited by those who would force you to be vaccinated for the remainder of the schedule. And they operate on this hysterical, really, viewpoint that without that, without herd vaccination, the notion that everybody has to be vaccinated, that we're always at risk. Well, the reality is that regardless of whether you have mandatory vaccination or not, there's no society on Earth in which there's ever been 100% vaccination.
Right.
It's simply not achievable. And you're always going to have lower than 80-90% vaccination, even in the middle of a contagion and with people's interests at stake to be vaccinated. As a result, the question becomes, well, if that is the case, then why have we had such success with like polio and other things for which there have been success with vaccination in the absence of 100% vaccination? The reason is that you diminish the risk so substantially through various steps, not entirely dependent upon vaccination, and then the issue becomes far less important. You don't have a contagion. I mean, the notion that the only way to prevent disease transmission is through vaccination is absurd. We know much better than that modern sanitation has been the primary force for, and that and antibiotics, but the primary force for deadening and lessening the extent of contagion in the world.
Right, exactly.
Vaccination in some respects has been helpful. I think that's true. But it's not been 100% vaccination. It's been a combination of some vaccination, public health actions, increased sanitation, use of antibiotics. So these are complicated issues that they would like to treat with a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's not really realistic. That's not fair. It's not scientifically sound, and it's very fascistic. It's a fascist view. It's a controlling view.
Right.
Force everyone to abide by this.
It's very controlling, and I've seen when doctors and scientists want to speak out, the opposite of what you're talking about in terms of that everyone needs to be vaccinated, there needs to be herd immunity. When some doctors and scientists want to come out and say, well, there's other research to show something different, they are very much ridiculed and silenced, and it's very unfortunate. And I agree that the media gets involved in this, and they start feeding into the hysteria, like the measles outbreak that has occurred once or twice recently, and it gets people all wound up. And then I see this fight between parents. Well, you need to stay locked up in a house if you're not vaccinated because I don't want my kids sick with the measles. And it's just, it really gets adults fighting each other, parents fighting each other over this. And I am certainly not anti-vaccine, and I agree with you. There are certain elements to it that can be beneficial, but I'm also very much pro everyone needs to make their own personal choice. We all have different genetics. We all have different bodies. We all have different health histories. And how can this person over here tell me what I have to put into my body? They don't know my history. They don't know my genetics. They don't know my children's genetics. And so there needs to be personal choice in that. And that's exactly what they're taking away, like you mentioned.
Right. There are many less intrusive ways of dealing with this. And as I mentioned, one way is to just remove the child from school when there's a contagion. And there are also common sanitation measures that can be taken so that children wash their hands, or that they use other sanitizing cleansers, and that they cover their mouths or wear a mask if they have some sort of a cold that may be communicable. So, there are all sorts of common sense things that we can do that are far less intrusive than this system that says, hey, you have to go to the doctor. There is an economic component to that independent of the vaccine sales, which is the whole pediatric community. Pediatricians depend upon this compulsion more to just get children into the pediatrician, and that way you can ensure that 100% go through a pediatric program, meaning that the economic interests of pediatricians are served by this. So they're among the most rabid proponents of it, and they also have a unique position because of the youth and vulnerability of children. Parents are quick to follow the dictates of a pediatrician because they're frequently, unaware of the potential risks and quite petrified by them. And so through scare tactics, you can lead them to spend quite a bit of money on the pediatrician by constantly going to the pediatrician for, monthly checkups and shots and so forth. So there is a whole industry built around this that benefits greatly, and it becomes a monopoly industry to the extent that government compels everyone to follow a schedule of vaccinations. So.
Right, and a very intensive schedule that has changed over the years. Now, how is the United States different from other countries in terms of pharmaceuticals? Is this pretty much are we an isolated country in regards to how pharmaceuticals are pushed, how they're forced, and how they're made to be seen as safe?
No, it's a global movement. The drug industry, the model created for regulation in the United States has been replicated all over the world. There are countries that don't have this regime, but the drug industry is a global enterprise that is very, very effective in ingratiating itself with governments, getting protection from governments, having exclusive patent and market protections that are extended beyond that for any other product. And so there's a long history of relationships between the drug industry and countries all over the world. This is I've explained this in my book, Global Censorship of Health Information. But also, there's a book, let me see if I can remember the name of it. I can't remember the name, but unfortunately there's another book by a Harvard professor that is a great one about the influence of the drug industry over medical education and Congress, and also the pharmacy industry. So they have their tentacles into everything, and it's really quite an extraordinary degree of control over information, over regulation, and over market access that they wield.
Well, where can people find more information about your work and your books?
The books are on Amazon.com, and Rise of Tyranny, Global Censorship of Health Information, and Restore the Republic are the three most recent ones. And they go to Emord.com for more information about my firm and our cases and
Excellent, Jonathan. Well, thank you for being a guest on my show this week.
You're welcome.
And thank you, listeners, for joining me here as well on Journey for Truth on iHeartRadio and YouTube. Until next time, have a fantastic week.